The county auction house sat just outside Missoula, Montana, a relic of a bygone era where livestock, equipment and unwanted things were shuffled from one owner to another without sentiment. The place smelled of rust, old leather and sweat, the air thick with the chatter of farmers, ranchers and traders who gathered to bid on whatever scraps of life were up for grabs. But tonight something was different. Tonight, the lot up for auction wasn't a rusted tractor or a broken saddle. It was a dog. A German shepherd sprawled out in the center of the concrete floor, unmoving. His fur was dull, caked with grime and scars that told stories no one in the room cared to hear. His ribs pressed sharply against his skin, each breath slow and deliberate, as if every inhale was a struggle. He did not lift his head. He did not flick an ear at the murmurs around him. The auctioneer sighed, shifting behind the wooden podium. He had sold many things in his years, cattle, machinery, even entire properties, but this was different. He knew no one wanted the dog. Next up, he said, clearing his throat. Lot 47. A pause. He glanced down at the paper in front of him, knowing it would do no good. There was no charming way to sell this one. Former military working dog, he announced. Records unclear. No known handler. History of unpredictable behavior. He hesitated, debating whether to read the last part aloud, but then decided against mercy. Final auction before euthanasia. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room, disinterested but mildly entertained. What's the point? Someone muttered. He's not worth a dime, another voice chimed in. Damaged goods. The dog did not react. He just lay there silent. The auctioneer adjusted his collar, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. Starting bid at $50, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Nothing. Not a single hand was raised. A low chuckle started somewhere in the crowd, spreading like wildfire. Laughter rippled through the room, careless and cruel, as the reality of the situation became a joke to those who had nothing better to do. $50 for a useless, broken dog? 40. The auctioneer tried again. 30. More laughter. From the back, someone called out mockingly, "How about you pay us to take him?" A woman in the front row, arms crossed, shook her head. He's a lost cause. The auctioneer exhaled, tapping the podium. He was about to move on, to announce the inevitable end to this sad affair, when, scrape, the sound of a chair sliding against the concrete floor. The room went silent. In the back row, a man rose to his feet, tall, broad-shouldered, with the build of someone who had spent his life doing hard things the hard way. A faded Marine Corps jacket clung to his frame, the edges worn from years of use. His face was partially hidden in the dim light, but his presence was undeniable. He didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I'll take him." Murmurs spread through the crowd. The auctioneer blinked. "Sir, you understand the liability?" "I understand," the man replied, his voice steady. His gaze never left the dog. For the first time all night, the German shepherd moved. Just slightly. His ears twitched, his sunken eyes flickering toward the man as if pulled by some invisible thread. The auctioneer hesitated only a moment longer before nodding. Final bid sold. A gavel struck wood, sealing the deal. No one knew it then, but this moment, this small, seemingly insignificant choice would change everything. The man in the jacket. His name was Ethan Walker, 34 years old. Former Marine. A man whose hands told stories of labor and war. Knuckles roughened by time and hardship. 3 years had passed since his last deployment, but the battle never really left him. It clung to him like a shadow, in the way he tensed at sudden noises, in the way he woke gasping for air in the middle of the night. His home, a small Montana ranch left to him by his grandfather, was both a refuge and a prison. His days followed an unbreakable routine. Coffee at dawn, tending to the few horses still on the land, trying and failing to drown out memories that refused to stay buried. The VA called regularly, leaving voicemails he never returned. The medications they prescribed collected dust in his bathroom cabinet. This morning, he hadn't planned on coming to the auction. But then he saw it, 6 lines of text in the local paper's classified section. Former military dog. Aggressive. No training possible. Final auction before euthanasia. Something about those words made his hands tighten into fists. Military dogs were supposed to be honored, retired with dignity, given the respect they had earned through sweat, blood, and loyalty. But this one had been discarded like an afterthought, his future reduced to 6 careless lines of ink. Now, standing in the auction house with the leash in his hand, Ethan stared at the dog. The German Shepherd did not move. "You sure you want to do this?" the auctioneer asked, shuffling papers. "Dogs got problems." Ethan's jaw tightened. "So do I." The man shrugged. "He's all yours. No refunds." Ethan crouched a few feet away from the dog, watching carefully. The shepherd was still as stone, his muscles tense beneath the patchy fur. His ears lay flat against his head, not in submission but in warning. "Hey buddy," Ethan said, his voice low and calm. "I'm Ethan." The dog's eyes flickered, but he didn't respond. Claire Thompson, the local veterinarian, watched from the corner of the room. She had really tried, to intervene on the dog's behalf, but red tape and military bureaucracy had kept her at arm's length. She had seen mistreated animals before, but something about this one unsettled her. She stepped forward. "His records are incomplete," she told Ethan quietly. "But he's been here 3 weeks. Won't let anyone touch him. Barely eats." Ethan kept his gaze on the dog. "What's his name?" "They've been calling him Zero." There was an unmistakable bitterness in Claire's voice. "Because that's what he's worth to them." Ethan exhaled through his nose. He shifted, moving just enough to let the dog know he wasn't a threat. "That's not your name anymore," he murmured. "We'll find you a better one." The moment that followed was so fast that later, no one could agree on exactly what had happened. The dog lunged. A blur of motion, teeth bared, muscles coiled, a force of raw, unrestrained aggression. Someone gasped. A chair scraped back. But Ethan didn't move. He didn't flinch. Didn't recoil. Instead, he held the dog's gaze. And in that split second, something passed between them. Recognition. Or maybe just understanding. The shepherd froze, jaws inches from Ethan's throat, hot breath mingling with the tension in the air. His amber eyes, once hollow, now burned with something deeper. Ethan didn't break eye contact. The dog's muscles twitched, uncertain. Then slowly, hesitantly, he backed down. A whisper spread through the room. "He should be put down," someone muttered. Ethan straightened. "No," he said firmly. "He's coming home with me." And just like that, the shepherd's fate changed. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was only the beginning. Ethan had tried everything: food, patience, distance. But the German shepherd refused to engage. He was either lunging in blind aggression or cowering in the corner, trembling so violently it was painful to watch. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't drink. He wouldn't even acknowledge Ethan's presence unless it was to snarl, warning him to stay back. By nightfall, exhaustion and frustration pressed in hard. Ethan sat on the edge of the porch, running a hand through his hair as the rain began to fall. His phone buzzed. "Claire." "Sometimes," she said gently. "They're too far gone." But Ethan's eyes never left the dog, watching as the shepherd paced restlessly along the fence line. Eyes darting, muscles coiled as if expecting an ambush. "He's not too far gone," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. "He's just lost." A distant rumble echoed across the valley. The first crack of thunder sent a ripple of tension through the air. Then it happened. The shepherd panicked. 1 second he was pacing, the next he was bolting, slamming into the fence so hard the wood splintered. He hit the ground, dazed but desperate, and ran. Ethan was on his feet instantly. "Shadow." The name slipped out before he even realized he had said it. The dog didn't stop. Ethan chased. Rain poured in sheets, soaking through his jacket. His boots sank into the mud with every step. But he pushed forward, sprinting after the dark blur that disappeared and reappeared between flashes of lightning. Half a mile. A mile. 2 miles. The shepherd ran like he was escaping hell itself. Then sudden silence. Ethan skidded to a halt. His heart pounded. The wind howled through the valley. And then in the darkness he saw it. A drainage ditch. Deep. Treacherous. The shepherd was trapped at the bottom, his paws slipping in the wet mud, his body trembling violently. He was cornered, wild-eyed, his breath ragged with terror. Ethan didn't move closer. Instead, he did something no one else ever had. He sat down. Right there in the mud, rain pelting his face, Ethan let out a slow breath. I know what it's like. The shepherd's ears flicked. When the thunder sounds like mortars. When every shadow holds a threat. When you can't trust anyone because trust got your friends killed. Lightning flashed. Thunder rolled. The shepherd watched. You can't live like that forever, Ethan continued, voice steady. I tried. It doesn't work. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The storm raged, then softened. Neither of them moved. Then slowly, tentatively, the shepherd took a step forward. Then another. Not close enough to touch. Not yet. But something had shifted. When they walked back to the ranch together, they were no longer just a man and a dog. They were survivors. Scene fades to black. Music swells. The truth no one wanted them to find. A week later, Claire showed up at Ethan's ranch, a thick manila envelope clutched in her hands. Her face was serious. Grave. The military finally released his records, she said, setting the envelope on the table. Ethan's fingers hovered over it for a moment before he opened it. Inside, official seals, redacted lines, classified documents. His real name is Rex, Claire said. Marine Corps. Special Operations. 3 combat tours. Ethan's throat tightened. He flipped through the pages, training logs, deployment reports, until something made him stop. A 6-month gap. Where was he during that time? Ethan murmured. Claire hesitated. We don't know. The records are missing. Ethan's jaw clenched. Then he saw it. Time-stamped reports from his last deployment. His own tour in Afghanistan. His breath hitched. No dog can sustain this, Ethan muttered, pointing to a section. They were running him 20 hours a day. That's not training. That's breaking. Claire pulled out one last document. It's worse than that, she said, voice barely above a whisper. The dates of his last deployment, they match yours. Ethan froze. The room was silent except for the rain tapping against the window. His hands trembled as he reached for the final paper. He was there, he whispered. The day we lost Baker's team in Kandahar. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Across the room, the shepherd, now called Shadow, lifted his head. His amber eyes locked onto Ethan's. And for the first time, there was recognition. Ethan's mind raced. Someone had wanted this dog forgotten. Someone had buried his past so deep he ended up in a civilian auction. Ethan stood abruptly. Shadow flinched. Who handled him? Ethan demanded. Who was his last commander? Claire hesitated. That part's completely blacked out. Ethan slammed a fist onto the table. There has to be something. She swallowed. I have a contact at the Pentagon. They might be able to help. Then a sound. A sharp, high-pitched whine. Ethan turned. Shadow stood at the edge of the room, ears pinned back, pawing at his own neck. Something was buried under his fur. Ethan moved slowly, his hands steady as he ran his fingers along the dog's thick coat. Then metal. Embedded. Overgrown by skin and time. A tag. Call the clinic, Ethan said, voice tense. We need to get that out. Later that night, under careful sedation, Claire extracted the small metal tag from Shadow's flesh. The numbers were worn. But one name remained legible. Handler, Major James Harrison. Ethan's face went pale. Harrison. Claire looked up. You know him. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. Everyone knew him. James Harrison. The man behind the enhanced training program. A ghost with a record that had been wiped clean. Rumors had swirled. Whispers about unethical methods, broken dogs, broken soldiers. But nothing had ever been proven. Until now. Ethan clenched his fists, staring down at Shadow, who lay groggy but watching. Watching him. Claire's voice was quiet. What are you going to do? Ethan's answer came without hesitation. Find Harrison. His gaze met Shadow's. Whatever they did to you, they won't get away with it. Neither of them knew that night that this decision would put both their lives at risk. Would uncover a truth that could shake the very foundations of the military K-9 program. And that the real battle had only just begun. Ethan exhaled slowly, staring into the firelight flickering across the porch. His voice was quiet but firm. I get them too, he admitted. The dreams. The ones where you're back there. Where you can't save them. Where everything goes wrong. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of Ethan's voice, his body still rigid but no longer locked in full tension. He was listening. More than that, he was understanding. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, the dog wasn't running or fighting. He was just there. Ethan kept talking, unraveling pieces of his past, his losses, the ambush that stole half his team, the nights he spent staring at the ceiling in a hospital bed, unable to silence the ghosts in his head, the guilt that clung to him like a second skin, never fully fading. His words weren't just for Shadow. They were for himself too. Morning arrived with unexpected stillness. Dr. Thompson pulled up the drive for her weekly checkup, but she stopped short at the sight before her. Ethan sipping coffee on the porch, a newspaper in hand. And at the bottom of the steps, Shadow lay, not pressed against a wall, not coiled in fear, not lunging in aggression. Just there. Not touching. Not entirely comfortable. But sharing the same space. Dr. Thompson kept her voice low. "This is remarkable." Ethan didn't look up. "What changed?" she asked. He turned a page, gaze still on the paper. "We recognized each other." He exhaled. "Sometimes that's all it takes." The rest of the day was filled with small, powerful shifts. Shadow hesitated but accepted food directly from Ethan's hand, though he still retreated to eat it. When a car backfired in the distance, instead of bolting for the tree line, he moved closer to the porch, closer to Ethan. That evening, Ethan was preparing Shadow's dinner when his phone rang. Claire's Pentagon contact. The conversation was brief, but its weight was instant. Ethan hung up, pulse hammering. His grip tightened on the counter. Shadow's ears flattened. He sensed the shift. The tension. Ethan turned, voice low. "They found Harrison." The dog froze. "He's working for a private military contractor." Ethan's jaw clenched. Still training dogs. Still getting away with it. His knuckles went white. Rage boiled in his chest. How many more? How many others had Harrison broken, discarded, erased? Shadow stepped forward, drawn by something in Ethan's voice. His legs trembled. His ears flattened tighter against his head at the mention of that name. Ethan crouched, meeting Shadow's eyes. "I promise you." His voice was steel. "He'll never hurt another dog. Not again. Whatever it takes, we're going to stop him." Shadow held his gaze. And in that moment, their scars, their pain, their past shifted into something else. A mission. A purpose. Shadow's posture changed. His body straightened, a ghost of his military bearing returning. That night, Ethan made a decision. He walked to the front door and left it open. Shadow stood in the yard, watching. Ethan leaned against the frame. "Your choice," he said. "Inside or out. You're not a prisoner here." Minutes stretched into eternity. The cold wind carried distant sounds from the valley. Shadow remained still, muscles tight. Then slowly, deliberately he stepped onto the porch. Climbed the steps. Crossed the threshold. He didn't settle. He stayed near the exit, still wary. But he had chosen to come in. Chosen to trust. Even if just a little. And that night, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, both man and dog slept without nightmares. The following morning, an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch. Sarah Baker. Ethan knew her before she even spoke. Widow of Lieutenant Michael Baker, his closest friend from the last deployment. She didn't call ahead. She just showed up, a sealed envelope clutched tightly in her hands. But what happened next stunned them both. Shadow moved first. Instead of the usual rigid stance, the wary retreat, the snarling warning, he approached her. Slowly. Carefully. His tail low but not tucked. Sarah froze, tears welling in her eyes. Her voice was barely a whisper. "That's him, isn't it?" Ethan didn't have to ask what she meant. "Mike's last letter," she continued. "He mentioned a dog. Said it saved 3 of his men." Before her voice broke. She didn't need to finish. Ethan already knew. Shadow stepped forward. And then, gently, so carefully it took Ethan's breath away, pressed his head against Sarah's hand. A soft, deliberate gesture. Sarah let out a sob, dropping to her knees, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Shadow didn't flinch. Didn't pull away. He accepted it. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. He remembers. His voice was hoarse. Military dogs never forget their people. Over coffee, Sarah told them everything. Her husband's letters, his concerns. He had been gathering evidence. He knew something was wrong with Harrison's program. That dogs were disappearing after showing signs of behavioral issues. Shadow lay at her feet, motionless. But his ears twitched at every mention of Harrison's name. His legs trembled again, the same way they had when Ethan first spoke of the man. Then Sarah hesitated. Reached into her bag. Pulled out a sealed envelope. "Mike sent me this," she whispered. "Said if anything happened to him." I should keep it safe. Ethan's pulse pounded as he tore it open. Inside, photographs, handwritten notes, training logs that shouldn't exist. And then, the truth. Harrison wasn't just abusive. He wasn't just cruel. He was systematically breaking dogs that could expose him, discrediting them, then having them erased from the program. Ethan's blood ran cold. Shadow stood suddenly, his body rigid, ears perked toward the window. A black SUV was at the end of the long dirt driveway. Even at that distance, Shadow knew them. Sheer terror. Ethan's voice was sharp. Get in the back room. Now. Sarah's hands shook as she gathered the documents. Who do I call? Claire. Dr. Thompson. Tell them to bring the files. The knock came. Two men stood at the door, dressed in civilian clothes, but their posture military. We heard you recently acquired a German Shepherd. One of them smiled. We'd be willing to offer substantial compensation. Behind Ethan, Shadow's growl deepened. Not defensive. Protective. Ethan's voice was ice. This is private property. He's not for sale. The second man stepped closer. Some dogs are too valuable to retire. His tone was smooth, calculated. Surely you understand. Ethan's lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. I understand perfectly. His voice was like steel. And I also understand that harassing a retired Marine and attempting to illegally acquire a former military asset are federal offenses. A beat of silence. The men turned, walked back to the SUV. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. Shadow was shaking. Ethan sat beside him on the floor. And this time the dog didn't just stay close. He leaned in. Ethan's voice was steady. They won't touch you again. Sarah stepped out of the back room, her face pale but her eyes burning with determination. She clutched the edge of the table as if steadying herself, then met Ethan's gaze head-on. Mike died trying to expose this, she said, voice trembling but resolute. We have to finish what he started. Shadow, standing beside Ethan, lifted his head, ears pricked forward. The fear in his posture had faded. What remained was focus. Determination. A silent, unspoken understanding passed between them. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were something more. The threat escalated 3 days later. Before the first rays of dawn had fully broken across the horizon, Claire Thompson's veterinary truck rumbled down the dirt road toward the ranch, kicking up a trail of dust. She barely put the vehicle in park before jumping out, her face ashen. Without a word, she shoved a manila envelope into Ethan's hands and hurried inside. The urgency in her movements sent a ripple of unease through him. He could feel it in his bones. This was bad. He spread the contents on the kitchen table. Medical reports. Incident logs. Official euthanasia records. Claire's voice was tight. 3 more military dogs. Euthanized at a private clinic. All labeled aggressive and untreatable. She exhaled sharply. All in the last month. A low guttural growl rumbled from Shadow's chest. His eyes tracked every word, his breath steady but deep. Ethan felt his own pulse quicken as he flipped through the documents. They're cleaning house, he muttered. Eliminating evidence before we can expose them. Claire nodded grimly. Harrison's private security firm just secured a major contract. They're training dogs for military contractors worldwide. No oversight. No regulations. A sharp knock at the door made them all freeze. Shadow was on his feet instantly, his entire body tensing. But something had changed. Gone was the cowering, traumatized animal. In his place stood a soldier, ready, aware, controlled. Through the window, Ethan saw him. A formal-looking man in a suit, holding up a badge. FBI. Ethan opened the door cautiously. Mr. Walker? The man's voice was steady, authoritative. Special Agent Marcus Reynolds. I need to speak with you. Ethan stepped aside, letting him in. They gathered in the living room. Shadow took position between Ethan and the agent, silent but watchful. Reynolds sat forward, his expression grim. We've been investigating Major Harrison's training programs for the past year, Reynolds began. Lieutenant Baker was our confidential informant before his death. Ethan felt his breath hitch. Sarah, sitting in the corner, paled. Reynolds' voice dropped lower. We had no idea Harrison was eliminating dogs who witnessed his worst abuses. He's been systematically wiping them out to cover his tracks. He looked directly at Shadow. Your dog may be the last surviving witness. A cold rage settled in Ethan's chest. How many? 27 dogs. In 3 years. All highly trained military assets, all suddenly declared unstable and eliminated. Reynolds exhaled, watching Shadow intently. Harrison got careless with this one. That's why he's still alive. Claire sat forward. The embedded ID tag, the one we removed? Reynolds nodded. It contained a GPS tracker. That's how Harrison's men found you. But it might also prove he was monitoring dogs after their official discharge. A direct violation of military protocols. Shadow's posture shifted. He moved slightly closer to Ethan, not out of fear but as if preparing to protect. His military instincts were returning, but now they were fueled by something different. Loyalty. Harrison has connections, Reynolds warned. High-ranking military officials. Private security firms. Even politicians. They've buried investigations before. We need hard evidence. Sarah hesitated, then spoke. What about Mike's documents? Reynolds exhaled. It's a start. But not enough. We need. A crack split the air. A gunshot. Ethan barely had time to react before Shadow launched himself at him, knocking him to the ground just as the window shattered. Glass rained down where he'd been sitting a second before. Reynolds drew his weapon. Everyone down. Claire ducked behind the kitchen counter. Sarah scrambled for cover. But Shadow moved. The dog methodically checked each entry point, his posture controlled, scanning for danger. The soldier inside him had fully awakened. 20 minutes later, local law enforcement found shell casings in the tree line. A warning shot, Reynolds said, holstering his weapon. They're trying to scare you off. His eyes darkened. Which means we're close to something they don't want us to find. That evening, as the ranch settled into uneasy silence, Ethan sat on the porch, Shadow at his side. The dog remained vigilant, but something was different. He wasn't just reacting, he was watching, analyzing, waiting. You saved my life today, Ethan murmured. Just like you saved those men in Afghanistan. Shadow turned, locking eyes with him. And in that moment, Ethan saw what Harrison had tried to destroy. Not just a military asset. A warrior. Unbroken. Tomorrow, Ethan vowed, they would stop running. They would start fighting back. At sunrise, Ethan woke to find Shadow standing at attention beside the bed. His eyes were alert. Focused. A silent, unspoken message passed between them. We need to train, Ethan said. Not like before. Something new. Over breakfast, Reynolds called with a warning. Harrison's security firm has deployed teams across 3 states. They're systematically visiting former placements of their military dogs. 2 more animals were put down yesterday. Claire arrived with training equipment. If we're going to protect him, she said, setting a bag down, he needs to trust us completely. And we need to trust him. They didn't use military obedience drills. They let Shadow set the pace. Basic medical examinations came first. In the past, any touch triggered violent reactions. Now, with Ethan sitting beside him, speaking softly, Shadow trembled but didn't retreat. The physical wounds are healing, Claire said, checking old scars. But they use pain as a training tool. Ethan clenched his jaw. Show me where. She did. Places where shock collars had burned his skin. Pressure points where harsh corrections had left lasting trauma. Each revelation fed Ethan's determination to bring Harrison down. The breakthrough came that afternoon. Instead of commands, Ethan started using conversation. Would you like to check the perimeter with me? Shadow's ears twitched. He considered. Then, without coercion, he moved to Ethan's side. Together, they walked the ranch boundary. Ethan pointed out security weaknesses. Shadow, in his own way, did the same, his posture shifting subtly, attention sharpening at key points. He wasn't following orders. He was thinking, deciding, choosing. And for the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was fighting back. It wasn't just handler and animal anymore. It was 2 veterans standing shoulder to shoulder, preparing for battle. Sarah Baker arrived at the ranch with more of her late husband's documents, her eyes brimming with emotion as she watched Ethan and Shadow move together in seamless unison. Mike would be proud, she murmured, voice thick with grief and admiration. This is what military working dogs were meant to be. Partners, not tools. With every passing day, the bond between Ethan and Shadow deepened. The German shepherd no longer hovered in the corners of rooms, waiting for danger to strike. He no longer flinched at every sudden movement, nor did he shrink away from touch. Instead, he chose where to rest at the foot of Ethan's bed, a silent guardian through the night. And during the day he patrolled the ranch with a calm, focused vigilance. Not out of fear. Not because he was programmed to. But because he had chosen this place, this man, as his mission. Then came the storm. Thunder had always been a trigger, a brutal, gut-wrenching reminder of explosions, gunfire, and chaos. Before, Shadow would retreat into the smallest, darkest space he could find, trembling and lost in the prison of his memories. But this time, as the first rumbles rolled over the mountains, he did something different. He pressed against Ethan's leg. Ethan looked down, his breath catching at what he saw. Shadow's eyes, those deep, intelligent eyes, were no longer filled with panic. They were searching for reassurance, seeking comfort in his presence instead of running. Ethan knelt, resting a hand on Shadow's back. "It's okay," he whispered. "We're safe here." Shadow blinked up at him, trusting. Choosing trust over fear. It was a victory, quiet but profound. That evening, as the last of the storm clouds drifted beyond the horizon, Claire arrived with news. "Harrison's company is planning a major demonstration," she said, unfolding a series of documents on the kitchen table. 2 weeks from now. They're bringing in military officials, private contractors, even foreign buyers. It's a full showcase of their enhanced training methods. Shadow's ears flattened at the mention of Harrison's name. But this time he didn't shake or recoil. Instead, he stepped forward, pressing close to Ethan's side, his stance firm, ready. A soldier prepared for his next mission. Ethan exhaled sharply, realization hitting him all at once. A public demonstration means witnesses. If we can expose them. "It's risky," Claire interrupted. "Harrison's men are still watching the ranch. And Shadow, are you sure he's ready?" Ethan turned to the German shepherd, observing the transformation that had taken place over the last few weeks. The scars, both physical and emotional, were still there. But something had changed. This wasn't a dog who had been broken. This was a soldier who had survived. Who had healed. Who had chosen to stand and fight. "He's more than ready," Ethan said softly. That night, for the first time since coming to the ranch, Shadow initiated contact, resting his head, just briefly, on Ethan's knee. A silent promise. "I've got your back." The story of Shadow's transformation spread through town like wildfire. It started small. Mark Wilson, the local feed store owner, had seen it firsthand during his deliveries to the ranch. "That dog's got the look," he told anyone who'd listen. "Same look my unit's dogs had back in Vietnam. He's not just any rescue. He's one of ours." Word traveled. First through the veteran community, then beyond. James Cooper, a retired Marine K-9 handler, drove 3 hours just to see Shadow with his own eyes. He arrived at the ranch, leaning on his cane, his expression dark with restrained fury. "I knew something wasn't right with Harrison's program," he said. "Lost 2 good dogs to his enhanced training methods. Both labeled unstable after they started showing injuries." Shadow stood beside Ethan as Cooper spoke, watching the old handler with quiet understanding. There was no fear in the dog's posture, only recognition. Cooper knelt slowly, meeting Shadow's gaze. "You remember the good ones, don't you?" His voice softened, carrying that distinct cadence only true handlers used. "The ones who treated you like a partner." Shadow's ears twitched, his body relaxing slightly. Harrison had tried to break him. But he had failed. Then came Patricia Martinez, whose son had served in Afghanistan with a military dog. She arrived at the ranch with a bag of food, not for Ethan, but for Shadow. "We'll meet," she insisted. "These heroes deserve the best." Shadow accepted the offering with quiet dignity. When Patricia wiped her eyes, no one commented. The local sheriff was next. Sheriff Robert Davidson had spent 20 years in the military before joining law enforcement. When he heard the full story, he made his stance clear. "This stops in my county." He jabbed a finger at the map on Ethan's table. "Harrison's people have connections, but they're not above the law. We'll set up patrols. Keep an eye on your access roads." And he did. Sheriff's deputies started making regular passes by the ranch. They'd stop to chat, let Shadow inspect their vehicles. Each positive interaction strengthened the dog's confidence. Then the children got involved. 9-year-old Emma Lewis, the principal's daughter, started a campaign, Protect Our Military Dogs. She organized a bake sale, raising over $2,000 for medical supplies and security equipment. When she visited the ranch to deliver the funds, something incredible happened. Shadow let her touch him. The dog who had once shied from all contact, who had flinched at every reach of a hand, stood still as Emma gently patted his head. "He's not scary," Emma announced proudly. "He's just been hurt. And now he needs friends." The turning point came when James Cooper returned. This time, he wasn't alone. A dozen veterans, all with experience in K-9 units, arrived at the ranch. They brought tools, supplies, and most importantly, expertise. Harrison's demonstration is in 10 days, Cooper said, spreading out blueprints and maps. We've got people on the inside, ready to document everything. But we need to make sure Shadow is protected until then. They got to work. Former security specialists upgraded the ranch's perimeter. Communications experts installed monitoring systems. Medical personnel established emergency protocols. And Shadow? He moved among them with quiet assurance. Observing. Learning. Preparing. As the sun set, the group gathered on Ethan's porch. Sarah Baker stepped forward, holding something in her hands, her husband's old dog tags. She attached them to Shadow's collar, letting them rest against his fur. A symbol. A declaration. Harrison thought he could erase what these dogs are, Cooper said, watching Shadow stand guard at the edge of the porch. But he forgot something important. He turned to Ethan. A warrior spirit, human or canine, can be wounded. But it can't be broken. Not when there are people who will fight to remember. The warning came at midnight, 5 days before the demonstration. Ethan and Shadow had just finished their final perimeter check when his phone buzzed. Agent Reynolds' voice was tight with urgency. They've moved up the timeline. Harrison's people are mobilizing. We intercepted communications. They're planning something within the next 24 hours. Ethan barely had time to register the words when Shadow suddenly froze. His ears pricked forward, his posture sharpening like a drawn blade. Something was out there, something human senses couldn't detect. Without hesitation, Ethan killed the porch lights, plunging the ranch into darkness. A heartbeat later, 3 black SUVs emerged at the far end of the access road, headlights off, creeping forward like predators in the night. Shadow let out a low, controlled growl. Not fear, not panic, but a soldier's warning. They're here, Ethan whispered into his phone. At least 6 men, maybe more. Local police are en route, Reynolds responded. 15 minutes out. Can you? The call cut off. No signal. They were jamming communications. Inside the house, Sarah Baker moved fast, activating the emergency alert system. The silent signal would reach every veteran who had pledged to protect Shadow. But they needed time, precious minutes that Harrison's men were determined to take from them. The first figure stepped into the porch light. He was military trained, his stance professional. Mr. Walker, he called out, voice calm, measured. Let's handle this like professionals. Major Harrison just wants his property returned. No one needs to get hurt. Property? Ethan felt his blood boil. You mean the 27 dogs you eliminated? The evidence you destroyed? Another figure emerged from the shadows. This time the voice sent ice through Ethan's veins. Major Harrison himself had come. They were unstable, Walker, Harrison said smoothly, as if discussing faulty equipment. Unfit for civilian life. We gave them a humane end. Shadow's growl deepened, muscles tensing. But this time he didn't tremble, he didn't cower. He held his ground, a warrior facing the enemy. Sarah stepped forward, voice shaking with fury. Like you did to the dog that saved my husband's unit before you marked him for elimination? Harrison laughed coldly. Still fighting battles your husband should have learned to avoid? A new sound cut through the night, the roar of approaching engines. But these weren't police sirens. 3 more SUVs rolled up. But these were different. Federal agents and law enforcement are 4 minutes out. A voice called from the darkness. James Cooper. Harrison, you might want to rethink your position. Harrison's expression twisted with rage. Take the dog. Now. His men rushed forward. But Shadow was already moving. Years of combat training snapped into action, not driven by fear but purpose. He wasn't the broken, trembling creature from before. He was precise, controlled. A soldier fighting for his mission. Ethan moved in perfect sync with him. They were a unit. Harrison's men expected chaos. Instead, they found themselves against a coordinated force. Veterans positioned themselves in a defensive perimeter. It was over before it even began. Then Harrison did something unexpected. He pulled out a shock collar, the same kind he had used to break his dogs. Shadow's reaction was instant, but not what Harrison expected. Instead of cowering, Shadow stepped between Harrison and Ethan. A soldier's stance. A protector's resolve. Ethan's voice was quiet, deadly. Still think you can control him? Shadow's eyes locked onto Harrison's, unwavering. He's not your weapon anymore. He never was. He's a soldier. And he's chosen his side. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Harrison's men hesitated. This isn't over, Walker, Harrison spat. That dog knows too much. And so do you. As the police flooded the property, Shadow held his position, watching Harrison retreat into the darkness. But there was no fear in his posture, no hesitation, only the quiet, steady vigilance of a warrior who had reclaimed his purpose. The morning of Harrison's demonstration dawned cold and clear. The private training facility sprawled across 30 acres, modern buildings surrounded by Montana wilderness. A perfect illusion of legitimacy. Military officials, private contractors, and foreign buyers gathered in the viewing area, oblivious to what was about to unfold. Ethan and Shadow arrived early, credentials secured through Reynolds' investigation. To anyone watching, they were just another prospective client and his trained military dog. But under Shadow's new tactical vest was a hidden transmitter, streaming live audio to federal agents monitoring from a van outside the compound. Stay in position, Dr. Thompson's voice came through their earpiece. Harrison's security is sweeping the perimeter. We move when the demonstration begins. Shadow scanned the facility, ears flicking as he caught familiar scents. Other military dogs, some he had trained with, some who might not have survived Harrison's program. Ethan could feel the tension in the air. Shadow's body was still, but his breathing had slowed, controlled. The way a soldier steadies himself before battle. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, Shadow wasn't running from it. He was ready to face it head-on. The facility buzzed with anticipation as high-ranking military officials and corporate representatives took their seats. Their presence confirmed what Ethan had long suspected. Harrison's influence ran deep, deeper than anyone outside the Shadows could imagine. Sarah Baker, disguised as a journalist, weaved through the crowd, her camera discreetly transmitting everything to Reynolds' team. Every step, every whispered conversation was being recorded. They needed evidence, and today they would get it. At precisely 9 a.m., Major Harrison strode onto the stage. The man was the picture of control: sharp suit, measured steps, a voice rich with authority. He projected success, vision, power. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried effortlessly across the grounds. Today, you will witness the future of tactical canine training. But Shadow wasn't listening. His ears flicked forward, his body tensing. Something wasn't right. A scent, a sound. Something unseen sent an unmistakable signal to his instincts. Ethan followed his gaze and spotted a row of kennels behind the main building. Something was happening back there. He pressed a finger to his earpiece. Claire, I need eyes on the back kennels. Claire's voice crackled through. Accessing security feeds now. Oh no. Ethan, they're moving the dogs. They're eliminating evidence. Shadow was already moving, his gait steady but urgent. Ethan followed without hesitation. They reached the kennels just as two handlers were lifting a sedated German shepherd into a transport van. Ethan's voice was steel. Stand down. Federal investigation in progress. The handlers froze, uncertainty flickering across their faces. These weren't Harrison's enforcers, just men doing a job. One of them hesitated, lowering his tranquilizer gun. These dogs are scheduled for retirement, he said weakly. Major's orders. Ethan stepped closer, gesturing to Shadow. Retirement? Like this one. Shadow stood tall beside him, a living testament to survival. Check his ID number. Look up what happened after Harrison labeled him retired. The younger handler's brow furrowed as he studied Shadow's tag. Recognition dawned. Wait, is that Rex? They told us he was euthanized due to combat stress. Shadow remained locked onto the sedated dog in the van. His message was clear. Not again. Not this time. A slow, deliberate clap echoed from behind them. Harrison stepped into view, flanked by two security personnel. His polished facade cracked for just a second as he took in Shadow standing defiant before him. Then he smirked. Walker, he drawled. I wondered when you'd make your move. I expected more theatrics. Ethan's voice was calm, unwavering. No theatrics, Major. Just the truth. About the dogs you've buried. The evidence you've destroyed. The lives you've taken. Harrison chuckled, but there was an edge to it. And who's going to believe you? His gaze flicked toward Shadow. A washed-up soldier and a defective dog? Shadow's response was immediate and powerful. Instead of snarling, instead of shrinking, he moved forward and sat. Posture perfect. Ears alert. Bearing unmistakably military. He wasn't a broken dog. He wasn't a failure. He was proof. Proof of everything Harrison had tried to erase. Murmurs rippled through the handlers. The younger one stepped away from the van, confusion and realization clashing on his face. "Sir," he addressed the senior officers gathering around, "we've been moving these dogs for months, but they never made it to retirement facilities." Harrison's cool exterior faltered. Then came the final blow. "Actually," a new voice cut in, "Major Harrison will be handling this personally." Agent Reynolds stepped into view, flashing his FBI credentials. "Apologies for the interruption, but this demonstration is now under federal investigation." Sarah Baker emerged from the crowd, no longer a journalist in disguise but a whistleblower armed with hard proof. She held up a thick folder. "These are training records," she announced. "They detail exactly what happens to the dogs that don't meet the major's standards." Harrison's security team moved to stop her, but they hesitated. Not because of the growing audience, but because of the German Shepherd standing between them and Sarah. Shadow didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply stood. A warrior standing his ground. More murmurs. Phones lifted. Foreign officials recorded everything. Dr. Thompson, a veterinarian from the investigative team, stepped forward. "These animals didn't fail training," she told the gathered crowd. "They were deliberately broken. When they showed signs of abuse, they were labeled unstable and eliminated." James Cooper's voice rang out. "Authorized?" he demanded, projecting damning images onto the large demonstration screen. Military training sessions turned into torture chambers. Dogs subjected to behavioral corrections that left them shaking hollow. And then there was Shadow. A before and after testament to resilience. Once discarded, now unbreakable. Ethan faced the crowd. "This dog," he said, resting a hand on Shadow's shoulder, "was one of your most successful military working dogs. 3 combat tours. Multiple commendations." Then he started showing signs of abuse under Major Harrison's enhanced training. He was scheduled for euthanasia before we intervened. Harrison was unraveling. "That dog is unstable," he snapped. "Watch you." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a familiar tactical device. A high-frequency emitter. A tool of control. He activated it, sending out the piercing tone meant to break trained dogs into submission. Shadow's ears flattened. His muscles tensed. But he didn't move. He turned his head slightly toward Ethan, waiting for direction. "That's the difference, Major," Ethan said, voice soft but deadly. "He's not reacting to fear anymore. He's making a choice." Military police arrived. Senior officials ordered Harrison's arrest. But Harrison, desperate, reached for a concealed weapon. "These dogs are my property," he snarled. "My program, my reputation." He never finished. Shadow moved with blinding speed, years of training fusing with newfound purpose. He intercepted Harrison with precision, disarming him in a flash. No rage. No mindless attack. Just pure control. The very thing Harrison had spent his life trying to destroy. As Harrison was dragged away in handcuffs, the sedated dogs were being carefully unloaded, each examined by medical teams. Each given a second chance. A decorated general stepped forward, meeting Ethan's gaze. His voice was solemn, heavy with understanding. "We had no idea," he admitted. "The reports." Ethan nodded. "Now you do." Shadow sat beside him, unwavering. A soldier, no longer a tool. No longer a victim. Just free. The facility had become a battlefield, but the war was finally over. Major Harrison's empire, built on fear and cruelty, was collapsing before his eyes. As military police secured the compound, Sarah Baker clutched the documents that had once belonged to her late husband, her fingers tightening around the evidence that had exposed the truth. "Mike would be proud," she whispered, glancing at Shadow. "You finished what he started." But before anyone could take a breath, a sharp cry sliced through the morning air. One of Harrison's dogs, recently released and still reeling from sedation, had bolted. Panic in its eyes, the young German Shepherd sprinted toward the facility's perimeter fence. Beyond it, a highway loomed, cars streaking by at high speed. Without hesitation, Shadow turned to Ethan. No words were needed. A lifetime of partnership spoke between them. Ethan gave a single nod, and Shadow sprang into action. His body moved with the precision of years of military training, but this time it wasn't for war. It was for rescue. The handlers chasing the frightened dog faltered, watching in as Shadow intercepted the runaway, not with brute force, but with strategy. He positioned himself between the terrified shepherd and the fence, standing his ground with a calm authority. It was a stance that spoke of experience, of understanding, of a soldier guiding another through the battlefield of fear. Dr. Thompson, watching from a safe distance, murmured he knows exactly what that dog is feeling. The younger dog, still disoriented, snapped and growled, a defense born of terror, the same reaction that had once marked Shadow for death. But Shadow didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. Instead, he slowly lowered himself to the ground, exposing his vulnerability while keeping steady eye contact. It was a silent message: you're safe. You're not alone. The transformation was almost imperceptible at first. The younger dog's posture shifted, its growl turning into a whimper. Then, a single hesitant step forward. The battle wasn't one with dominance, it was one with trust. Ethan turned to the military officials gathered behind him. This, he said, his voice filled with quiet intensity, is what these dogs are capable of when treated with respect instead of fear. A hushed silence fell over the group. Then, James Cooper, leaning on his cane, spoke. We used to call it a battle buddy. Soldiers helping soldiers. Harrison tried to break that instinct. He failed. As the younger dog finally approached Shadow, pressing its muzzle against him in cautious acceptance, more than one observer wiped their eyes. Shadow led the dog back to safety, staying close as Dr. Thompson's medical team took over. Agent Reynolds took a step forward, addressing the stunned officials. That, he said, gesturing to Shadow, as the dog Major Harrison claimed was too dangerous to rehabilitate. The one he ordered destroyed to cover up his own failures. A high-ranking general stepped through the crowd, his eyes locked onto Ethan and Shadow. Mr. Walker, he said solemnly, I believe we owe both you and this remarkable animal an apology and a debt of gratitude. Sarah Baker, still documenting every moment, captured the image that would later define the entire investigation. Shadow, standing tall beside his handler, a symbol of resilience, of justice, of hope. A foreign observer broke the silence. What happens now? Ethan glanced at Shadow, who sat at his side, his quiet dignity commanding the respect of every soldier present. Now, Ethan said, we help the others. Every dog that survived this program deserves the same chance Shadow got. Dr. Thompson stepped forward, a warm smile forming. They'll need rehabilitation. But after today, she looked down at Shadow. Well, I'd say he's given us the perfect blueprint. The facility was secured. The evidence was undeniable. Harrison was finished. And yet, fate had one final challenge in store. That night, as the last group of rescue dogs was being transferred, disaster struck. One of Harrison's former associates, desperate to erase the remaining proof, breached security. Minutes later, flames erupted in the kennel area. The fire spread fast, swallowing the wooden structure in thick smoke. Dr. Thompson and her team scrambled to evacuate the remaining dogs, but two young shepherds, still groggy from sedation, were trapped inside. Then, without warning, Shadow broke away from Ethan's side. Shadow and Ethan shouted, but it was too late. The German shepherd had already disappeared into the inferno. The fire department was en route, but everyone knew they wouldn't arrive in time. Inside the burning building, Shadow moved like a ghost through the smoke. His training took over, guiding him to the two struggling dogs. Using gentle nudges and short, urgent barks, he roused them, pushing them toward the exit. They stumbled out into waiting arms, coughing but alive. But then a sickening crack. A burning beam collapsed, cutting off Shadow's escape. Ethan's heart pounded as he saw his partner through the flames, searching desperately for a way out. Smoke thickened. The fire roared higher. Shadow! Ethan ran forward, but strong arms held him back. Shadow was trapped. And the fire was closing in. He's not going to make it. Someone shouted over the chaos, their voice barely carrying over the roar of the collapsing structure. The fire had spread rapidly, consuming the kennel in an unstoppable blaze. Smoke billowed into the night sky, flames licking hungrily at what remained of the facility. Inside, Shadow was still trapped. Ethan's heart pounded. He started forward, ready to charge into the inferno himself, but a firm grip on his arm yanked him back. James Cooper, the veteran handler, held him fast. Wait, Cooper said, his eyes locked on the blaze. There was something in his voice, a quiet certainty. Watch. Through the swirling smoke and flickering fire, a shadow moved. Not just any shadow. The German shepherd, battered, cinched, but still fighting. His powerful frame moved with purpose, his mind working even through the suffocating heat. Then, in a stunning display of intelligence and survival instincts, Shadow began ramming a weak spot in the kennel's rear wall. Again. And again. Every muscle in his body strained, his breath coming in labored gasps. Finally, crack. The wall gave way. With a final burst of strength, Shadow forced himself through the jagged opening and staggered into the open air. He made it only a few yards before his legs buckled beneath him. The moment he hit the ground, the structure behind him groaned one last time before collapsing completely into a heap of burning wreckage. Ethan was at his side in an instant. "Stay with me, buddy." His hands ran over Shadow's body, burns along his left side, labored breathing. Smoke inhalation. He could feel the desperate rise and fall of the dog's chest, could see the pain in his dark, glassy eyes. Dr. Thompson rushed forward with a medical kit. "His condition is critical," she said, already assessing the damage. "We need to move him now." They loaded Shadow into the emergency transport, and Ethan climbed in beside him, cradling his partner's massive head in his lap. As the vehicle sped toward the veterinary hospital, Ethan kept talking to him. "You don't get to quit on me, Shadow. We've come too far. You hear me?" Through the haze of pain, Shadow's gaze remained locked on Ethan. The same unwavering loyalty that had carried them through every battle, every hardship. And now it would have to carry them through one more. The veterinary clinic became a battleground of a different kind. While doctors and technicians worked tirelessly to save Shadow, Ethan sat motionless in the waiting area, his hands still blackened with soot. He barely noticed when Sarah Baker entered, carrying a folded flag, Lieutenant Baker's old service flag. Without a word, she draped it over his shoulders. Ethan gripped the fabric, his breath hitching. "I failed him," he whispered, voice raw. "Just like I failed my team in Afghanistan. I should have stopped him from going into that building." James Cooper, standing quietly nearby, finally spoke. "That's not what happened, son." He placed a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Shadow made a choice. The same choice any soldier would make for their brothers in arms. You didn't fail him. You gave him a purpose." The words hit hard. Ethan let out a shuddering breath, his composure cracking. The bond between handler and dog was more than partnership, it was a brotherhood. And right now his brother was fighting for his life. News of Shadow's bravery spread like wildfire. The small Montana town mobilized in ways Ethan never expected. Mark Wilson from the local feed store organized a community-wide effort, ensuring someone was always at the clinic to offer support. Emma Lewis, the 9-year-old who had first connected with Shadow at the ranch, convinced her elementary school to start a fundraiser. Within hours, Save Our Shadow posters were plastered in shop windows and donation jars overflowed. Veterans from across the state arrived, some offering expertise, others simply standing in silent solidarity. James Cooper reached out to his old network of canine handlers, and soon, messages of support came from military veterinarians across the country. A retired Air Force medical transport team even volunteered to fly in specialized equipment. Sheriff Davidson stationed deputies outside the clinic, ensuring Shadow's safety. "That dog protected our town," he said firmly. "Now it's our turn to protect him." A prayer vigil was held in the clinic's parking lot, candles flickering in the cool night air. Hundreds stood together, farmers, soldiers, school teachers, old and young alike. Sarah Baker worked tirelessly to spread the story to the media. What started as a local effort became national news. Shadow wasn't just a hero, he was a symbol of resilience, of the bond between a warrior and his partner. 3 days later, Dr. Thompson gathered everyone in the waiting room. She cleared her throat, but her voice still wavered with emotion. "The care you've helped provide, the specialized equipment, the round-the-clock treatment, it's made all the difference." She took a deep breath before delivering the news. Shadow stabilized. A hush fell over the room before breaking into cheers. Ethan barely heard them. He was already moving, desperate to see his partner. Shadow lay on a cushioned bed, IVs attached, monitors beeping steadily. He looked weak, vulnerable, but when he heard Ethan's voice, his tail thumped once. Just once. But it was enough. Ethan knelt beside him. "Look at all these people here for you, buddy." His voice was thick with emotion. "A whole damn army." Dr. Thompson wiped at her eyes. "This is more than just a dog's recovery," she murmured. "This is proof that when a community refuses to give up on its own, miracles happen." The road to recovery would be long. Shadow would need months of rehabilitation, but he wouldn't walk that path alone. The people who had fought for him, who had believed in him, would be there every step of the way. And as Ethan sat beside his partner, running a hand over his fur, he knew one thing for certain. They had both been broken once, but together they would heal. For years, Ethan had wondered why Shadow was hunted like an enemy, why Harrison had been so determined to eliminate him as a witness. Now the truth lay bare in a classified report, one that would change everything. The mission took place in the unforgiving terrain of Kandahar province during Ethan's final deployment. Shadow had been assigned to Lieutenant Baker's unit for a high-risk reconnaissance operation. But the details in this report revealed a horrifying betrayal. Shadow had sensed the ambush long before it happened. He had tried to warn them. His instincts, honed by training, sharpened by experience, were screaming that something was wrong. But his handler at the time, following Harrison's direct orders, ignored him. Ethan's fists clenched as Reynolds continued. Harrison was obsessed with proving that his aggressive conditioning was superior to traditional handling. He wanted total obedience. No hesitation. No independent thinking. Shadow wasn't just disobeying that day, he was proving Harrison wrong. The report detailed how Shadow fought against his handler's control, breaking free to warn Baker's unit. His frantic barking, his refusal to move forward, it was an act of defiance, but also an act of salvation. And it worked. The warning gave Baker's men the few precious seconds they needed to reposition before the ambush was fully sprung. Lives were saved. But Shadow's actions didn't just defy orders, they destroyed Harrison's entire philosophy. He risked everything to protect them, Ethan murmured, his hand resting on Shadow's head. And for that he was punished. Dr. Thompson, flipping through Shadow's old medical records, made a chilling discovery. The injuries Shadow suffered that day weren't just from enemy fire, she said, voice tight with anger. Some of these wounds, they were inflicted afterward. Corrective training, Harrison called it. Ethan's stomach churned. He had always sensed Shadow's deep-seated fear of handlers, his reluctance to obey certain commands. Now he knew why. Shadow hadn't just been physically wounded, he had been broken, betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect him. And then Sarah Baker walked in, holding something that made the room fall silent, her late husband's personal journal. My husband wrote about that day in detail, she said, steady but emotional. He described how Shadow was trying to pull his handler back from a specific route. He fought harder than any of us realized. Ethan leaned forward as she read the words written by a man who hadn't lived to see justice. At first, we thought the dog had lost control, but when the first shots rang out, it became clear, Shadow wasn't attacking us. He was leading us to safety. Ethan exhaled sharply, gripping the arms of his chair. That position, the one Shadow was trying to get them to. He swallowed hard. That was my team's fallback point. He wasn't just warning them. He was trying to bring them to us. A thick silence filled the room as the weight of the revelation settled. Shadow had been right all along. He had saved countless lives that day, including those of soldiers Ethan had fought alongside. And yet, instead of commendation, he had been cast aside. Sarah's voice broke slightly as she read her husband's final note. Some acts of courage can't be measured by human standards. Sometimes the truest form of loyalty means disobeying orders to do what's right. Ethan's breath caught. He looked down at Shadow, the dog who had fought so hard, suffered so much, and yet had never given up. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a survivor. This changes everything, Reynolds said, closing the folder. With this evidence, we can take down Harrison's entire program. Shadow's story won't just bring justice, it's going to reform the way military working dogs are treated forever. But the fight wasn't over. The truth about Harrison's program was worse than anyone had imagined. At the formal military review board hearing, the entire system of abuse came to light. Reynolds presented damning evidence, 2 separate sets of records, one for official review, the other containing the real data. Harrison manipulated everything, Reynolds explained. He created a system where any dog that resisted was marked as unstable and eliminated. They weren't counted as failures. They just disappeared. The room fell into horrified silence as the numbers came to light. 43 dogs. 43 highly trained, combat-tested military working dogs, all erased from the records because they refused to be broken. This wasn't training, Dr. Thompson said, voice trembling with controlled fury. This was systematic torture. Fear-based conditioning designed to destroy every natural instinct these animals had. The most damning evidence of all came from Harrison's private communications. He had bragged about his ability to silence whistleblowers, about how Lieutenant Baker's death had conveniently buried the truth. The deception, the cruelty, it went beyond just the dogs. It had affected soldiers, their missions, and the very integrity of the military's K-9 program. But the world was watching now. Shadow's presence at the hearing, fully recovered, standing tall beside Ethan, sent a powerful message. This wasn't just about a dog. This was about the soul of military service. About the bond between soldier and K9 and the betrayal that had nearly destroyed it. The ruling was swift and decisive. Harrison was dishonorably discharged, his contracts terminated, his program dismantled. Military working dog policies underwent immediate reforms. And Shadow? Shadow became the face of that change. 6 months later, Ethan's ranch was no longer just a place to heal, it was a second chance for dogs like Shadow. The Second Chance K9 Rehabilitation Center was born. Shadow, once a discarded soldier, now led the way in rehabilitating other traumatized military working dogs. He helped dogs like Scout, a Belgian Malinois marked for euthanasia due to combat stress, learn to trust again. Within months, Scout was matched with a retired Marine struggling with PTSD. They healed together, just as Ethan and Shadow had. You know, Ethan said, watching Shadow interact with a new rescue, these dogs don't need to be retrained. They just need to be reminded who they really are. And thanks to Shadow, they would never be forgotten again. They didn't need to be fixed. They needed to be reminded of who they were. Beneath the trauma, beneath the scars, their core instincts remained. Loyalty, protection, companionship. It was never about breaking them down, it was about helping them trust those instincts again. And as the world took notice of the Second Chance K9 Rehabilitation Center, everything began to change. The facility, once a quiet ranch in Montana, quickly became a beacon of hope within military circles. Senior officers, once skeptical, now sent their most challenging cases here, admitting that conventional rehabilitation had failed these battle-hardened dogs. The numbers didn't lie, over 90% of the dogs who completed the program successfully transitioned to civilian life. They were finding new purpose, whether as therapy animals, police K9s, or lifelong companions to the veterans who needed them most. Sarah Baker took the mission further, stepping into the role of outreach coordinator. Her husband had documented the fatal flaws of traditional training methods, and now she used those records to reshape military policy. Mike believed in the bond between handler and dog, she told officials. What we're doing here proves he was right. And then there was Shadow. His transformation was the most remarkable of all. The dog who had once been discarded, marked as damaged beyond repair, now moved through the facility with quiet confidence. He greeted every new arrival with a mix of authority and reassurance, sensing what each dog needed before anyone else did. Some required space, others a guiding presence. But they all needed one thing above all else: hope. Shadow gave them that. Dr. Thompson, who had studied military working dogs for decades, documented Shadow's methods. He adapts, she noted in her reports. He knows when to push and when to wait. This isn't just instinct, it's emotional intelligence, something traditional training often suppresses. And by allowing these dogs to express it, we're seeing unprecedented success. Shadow's impact stretched far beyond the ranch. His story sent shockwaves through the highest levels of military command. Policies changed. The Department of Defense introduced groundbreaking reforms known as the Shadow Protocol, ensuring independent oversight of training facilities and mandatory psychological evaluations for all service dogs. But the most significant change? The military finally acknowledged what these dogs truly were: not tools, not expendable assets, but warriors who deserve dignity, respect, and care. Congress took action, passing the Military Working Dog Protection Act. Funding was secured for post-service medical care. Aggressive training methods were banned. Every military dog was now tracked, ensuring none would ever disappear from the records again. Shadow's story had rewritten history. But the ripple effect didn't stop at the military. Law enforcement agencies restructured their K9 training programs, shifting from dominance-based techniques to trust-based partnerships. Major military training centers across the country revised their handling protocols, and incidents of handler injuries and dog washouts plummeted. Even international military organizations sent delegations to Montana, eager to learn from the program that had changed everything. Financially, the results were undeniable. Investing in proper rehabilitation extended the service life of military working dogs, reducing long-term costs. And the success of rehabilitated dogs in civilian roles, law enforcement, therapy work, even search and rescue, proved their value far beyond the battlefield. Dr. Thompson's research on Shadow's recovery was published in leading veterinary journals, setting a new global standard for treating combat trauma in working dogs. The evidence was clear. Addressing both physical and emotional wounds didn't just help the dogs, it made them stronger, more capable, and ready for a second chance at life. But perhaps the most powerful shift wasn't in policy. It was in perspective. The military no longer saw these dogs as disposable equipment. They were recognized as service members, deserving of honor and care long after their missions had ended. Handler training programs evolved, emphasizing the deep, unbreakable bond between human and canine. And it was Shadow and Ethan who stood before military committees, proving through their own journey that trust, not fear, created the strongest teams. 2 years after Second Chance K9 opened its doors, its legacy had grown far beyond that Montana ranch. On a crisp autumn morning, Ethan and Shadow stood side by side, watching a new group of veterans arrive. The program had expanded, but its core remained unchanged, healing warriors, both human and canine, together. The once-abandoned barn was now a state-of-the-art training facility. But Shadow's favorite spot was still the quiet corner where he and Ethan had first learned to trust each other. Their bond had inspired a new approach to recovery, known as the Shadow Walker method, focusing on the parallel healing of both veteran and dog. The results were undeniable. PTSD symptoms in participating veterans dropped significantly. Rehabilitated dogs found purpose again, forming unbreakable connections with those who understood their struggles. Shadow, now graying around the muzzle but still carrying himself with military bearing, had become a legend. Veterans swore he could sense their pain before they even spoke it. His silent presence, his steady gaze, it reminded them they weren't alone. Sarah Baker ensured that her husband's legacy lived on, curating a library at the center dedicated to military working dog welfare. Inside, Mike's original reports on Harrison's abuses served as a permanent reminder of why this work mattered. Every visitor, every handler who walked through those doors carried forward the lessons learned from Shadow's fight for justice. The annual Shadows Run event became a national tradition. Handlers, veterans, and their dogs gathered to celebrate healing, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds they shared. People traveled from across the country to honor the dog who had changed everything. One morning, as Ethan and Shadow finished their daily perimeter walk, they came across a young veteran struggling with his new therapy dog. No words were exchanged. Shadow simply walked up, sat beside them, and waited. Later, the veteran would say that moment, the quiet understanding, the presence of a dog who had walked his own path to healing was what restored his faith in recovery. But the truest measure of Shadow's legacy came in the form of letters. Thousands of them. From soldiers, handlers, families whose lives had been changed by the program. Stories of redemption, of second chances, of battles won not on the battlefield, but in the fight to reclaim their lives. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, Ethan and Shadow sat on the porch, watching their legacy unfold. The dog who had once been discarded, broken, left for dead, had not only healed, he had become the guide for countless others. Together, they had transformed pain into purpose, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal with trust, patience, and unwavering loyalty. Shadow's journey is more than just a story, it's a testament to the resilience of those who serve, human and canine alike. For our generation, for those who have carried invisible wounds, his story is a reminder that no one is beyond saving. That the fight doesn't end when the war is over. That redemption is always possible. And most of all, that sometimes all we need is a second chance.